Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the symposium of the LaRouche Organization. Today is Friday, December 26th, the day after Christmas. There's an enormous amount going on in the world right now, but of particular interest are a group of files released from a Freedom of Information Act request that show the discussion process between Russian President Vladimir Putin, he may have been prime minister at the time, I forget, with then President George Bush. And to my surprise, their conversations seemed to be quite reasonable, although I must say I think it was a stupid question of Bush to ask why having Ukraine would join NATO would be a mistake. But Putin was very clear the Russian position hasn't changed. And they were engaged in a substantive discussion, which they feared might be a model for future presidents, that as much as Russian-US relations were not at the best ever in those years, 2000 and later, they got much worse under Barack Obama, who did everything he could to totally destroy a conduit of conversation and dialogue with the other leading nuclear superpower. And of course, Joe Biden was incapable of having a serious conversation with anyone, given his failing mental state. Now, in the last 24 hours, we have had US airstrikes on Nigeria, supposedly fighting ISIS, and the Nigerian government says they supposedly welcomed this action. But you have to ask, why are we having problems with ISIS? Who created this? What is the overarching situation on the planet as a whole? And as we are on the cusp of entering the year of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, what was the role of the United States supposed to be in the world? Why would John Quincy Adams have said when he was Secretary of State in 1821, on the 4th of July, that with one stroke, the founding of our republic did away with the idea that nations could be won by conquest, or that you got freedom through conquest. So we are taking it upon ourselves in the LaRouche movement in this 250, or it's really the 251st year of our republic's declared existence and declared independence from the British Empire, to remind the American people about what the intention of our nation was as a bulwark against colonialism, as a defender of people yearning to be free, not militarily, not through force, but through economic development and cooperation. So that being said, I would like to bring on my two guests, who are Christopher Sayre, my husband and historian. Hi, Chris, welcome. And Richard Freeman. Both are longtime associates of Lyndon LaRouche, excellent researchers. Rich Freeman has just a couple years on both of us, so he was
just a couple.
Yeah, just a couple. So you had the great privilege of working with Lyndon LaRouche for a decade and a half or so, longer than we did. But so I'll just leave it there, and the two of you go ahead, however you want to begin this.
Well, I thought, if it's possible, Chris could start just saying a couple of things about Quincy Adams, if he wants, and I would like to then introduce the fight that led to the Monroe Doctrine, which is what Quincy Adams wrote into the 7th inaugural address of President James Monroe, and a few quotes from it, so people actually know what's in the doctrine. And then we have other things which I think we'll be discussing.
Sure. Well, I mean, I actually don't. I have a couple of slides, but they would fit in for later. Anyway, I mean, the thing that's been striking me about the whole question of the Monroe Doctrine is how little people know about it, but they're throwing the name around right now as if they know all about the Monroe Doctrine. They know the history of it. And yes, of course, what's being employed right now by President Trump in Venezuela is simply a new version of the Monroe Doctrine. And I think what we're going to go through tonight and what we would hope to bring back is the original intent of the Monroe Doctrine, which was an emphatically anti-colonialist, Republican concept of nation states cooperating together in a community of principle of sovereign nation states, as John Quincy Adams referred to. And I mean, just to give you a sense of who, first of all, the Monroe Doctrine comes from John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams, his first introduction into the British Empire was standing on a hill watching the Battle of Bunker Hill proceed, and of course the death of a dear friend of the Adams family, Warren, and that this was embedded in his soul as a young boy, the evil of the British Empire. And I think he was a student of Plato. He was a very, very philosophical mind. Learned many languages. He was with Dana in Russia. Charles Dana, was that his name? I forget, but ambassador to Russia, or the representative from the United States to Russia. At an early age, he traveled all over Europe. He was the ambassador to Russia himself later on, during the Napoleonic Wars. He was the one of the key people that organized the Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812 on very favorable terms for the United States Republic, and he was the vice president of James Monroe. And later on, we're gonna as we've said in the past, we are gonna do a series. Going to continue the series on the presidents and talk about the presidency of James Monroe in more detail, because I think James Monroe is a very important president and a very fascinating president. And you'll see from, I think, what Richie's going to go through, the way that Monroe gets organized around this question of the Monroe Doctrine is because of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams uniquely organized Monroe to see things from this Republican standpoint, and to make a clear break from the British and their enticements, as Richie will go through. So I would just open it up with that, and I hope that people will have a better understanding of the Monroe Doctrine, and that we can bring our nation back to the real principles of the Monroe Doctrine immediately.
Thanks, Chris. The thing is, just taking up on what Chris is saying, I mean, Quincy Adams was a universal thinker, one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century, and one of the greatest thinkers in the history of the United States, and one of the greatest presidents and secretary of states. He stands, I think, along with Washington and Lincoln and Roosevelt, at a level that actually shaped the principles and developed and furthered them as presidents and in other positions in a way that exceeded many others who were still nonetheless very great people. What I would like to do is just to set the stage for this, is give people a sense of what the Monroe Doctrine is. But I just want to say that if you look at the Treaty of Vienna, which was 1814 through 1815 in Vienna, and it had the Quadruple Alliance. It had Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Britain. And at that conference, they discussed bringing the Bourbon family back onto the throne in France, and the pitch is that they're dealing with the question of not wanting to have the French and another Bonaparte do what they did to Europe. But if you really read this and you look at it, the is the United States. They can deal with fellow monarchies. They cannot deal with a country that does not believe in monarchy and that believes in not only the equality of everyone, but the development of the creative powers of everyone and a conception of man which is worlds apart from a monarchy. And so really you could say that from the point of the Treaty of Vienna and this quadruple alliance, and the United States having at least repelled during this time, they're in the process of repelling the second invasion by the British against the United States after the American Revolution. The third one would be the Civil War, which the British basically ran to divide the country. They are terrified of the United States. Now, in this process, to take up what Chris said, there was a debate. I mean, this is, as you'll see in a second, it's the seventh. Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State for President Monroe from 1817 until the beginning of 1825, when he then becomes President of the United States. And in this period, the British decide under their Prime Minister, whose name is George Canning, and if I can have the slides, if it's possible. Okay, let me go down. I have to click on it probably. Okay, there's George Canning. So he's British Foreign Secretary, September 16th, 1822 to April 30th, 1827. So he proposes, and you'll see the indispensable role of John Quincy Adams and the whole background, which Chris was developing. So he proposes to the United States, he says, look, you know, Russia, Prussia, they're all planning to do some very bad things in Ibero-America, South America. So why don't we, you and the United States and Britain, team up, and we will have and this was literally the special relationship, and we will make sure that we together stand against them in Ibero-America. And you have to remember, you know, he's proposing this in 1823. This is being proposed 8 years or 9 years after they burnt down the Capitol. The British burnt down the Capitol, and America has no intention of doing that. But that's what Canning says. So it's the Reestablishment Special Relationship. The interesting thing was that both Monroe and Jefferson, former President Thomas Jefferson, were disoriented. And I just want to read very briefly. This is the October 17th, 1823 letter that Monroe writes to Jefferson, who's still alive. Remember, the second president of the United States. And he's asking his advice. And he tells him that Richard Rush, who was the American ambassador to Great Britain at that time, has had two meetings. Rush conveyed to him two meetings that Rush had with Canning, where this proposal of an American-British alliance to protect Ibero-America is put out. So he says, "Dear sir," this is his letter, this is Monroe's letter to Jefferson, trying to get the advice of a former president. "I transmit to you two dispatches which were received from Mr. Rush while I was lately in Washington, which involve interests of the highest importance. They contain two letters from Mr. Canning suggesting designs of the Holy Alliance against the independence of South America and proposing a cooperation between Great Britain and the United States in support of it against the members of the alliance." And then he goes through this and says, well, I seem to think that that's not a bad idea. And so Jefferson, so that letter is October 17th, 1823, and Jefferson responds, and from Monticello, where he's living, of course. And he says, "Dear sir," in the letter, "I am clearly of Mr. Canning's opinion that it would prevent instead of provoking war, with Great Britain withdrawn from their scale," meaning the quadruple alliance, the four of the powers that ran the Congress of Vienna, and shifted that of our two continents, all Europe combined would not undertake a war for how would they propose to get at either enemy without superior fleets? So both are taken in. And Quincy Adams looks at this thing and says, you know, and that doesn't make the Monroe the worst person in the world. I'm just saying that's what happened.
Right.
And Quincy Adams says, whoa, this is, you know, this can't be. Now, it's true at that point, one of the reasons he gives is that the United States had recognized the La Plata, which was Argentina, Brazil, and other countries' independence on the continent of South America, and had not. But that's not what his concern is. His concern is that he will never allow that to happen because he knows what the British really want to do. And I think, therefore, this gives special urgency to what is the Monroe Doctrine, which is
I have the quotes real quick from something that John Quincy Adams wrote on that, exactly that point. It's very short, but I'll just read it because it's very pungent. He says, so long as Great Britain withholds the recognition of that independence of those nations, we may, as we certainly do, concur with her in the aversion to the transfer to any other power of any of the colonies in this hemisphere, heretofore yet belonging to Spain. But the principles of that aversion, so far as they are common to both parties, resting only on a casual coincidence of interests, in the national point of view, selfish on both sides, would be liable to dissolution by every change of phase in the aspect of European politics. Britain and America would not be bound by any permanent community of principle. This is really interesting because the British say we will. They basically say, yes, we agree that those countries should be free from Spain. Whether they'll be recognized, their independence will be recognized or not, is for a future time to determine. And of course, as Richie just said, we had recognized the independence of those nations. And so JQA is saying, even though we converge, it seems we converge. It seems that we, and that what Canning is proposing that we converge on, we don't, because it's just a coincidence. There's no actual principles. We don't share the same principles as to why we're saying this should be the case at this point, if ever.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper, right? But that's exactly the case. So I would like to just, if people will indulge me, read like for about 4 minutes from the Monroe Doctrine, because most people have never read it. And that's a very, very unfortunate, because it's a magnificent doctrine. And I wanted to say one thing, which Chris and I discussed earlier, what it is not, and yet it is represented as being. So this is just sections of this. As I said, what happens is James Monroe is presenting his annual message to Congress on December 2nd, 1823, about a month and a half after the exchange between Monroe and Jefferson. But the section on what's going to be the government's policy is written by John towards foreign affairs, is written by John Quincy Adams. The government of the United States has been desirous by this friendly proceeding, and this is, he discusses earlier, the fact that we're now working peacefully with Russia to work out certain agreements respecting territories in northwestern North America, which is where Alaska would be and other places. The government of the United States has been desirous by this friendly proceeding of manifesting the great value which they have invariably attached to the friendship of the Emperor of Russia and their solicitude to cultivate the best understanding with his government. In the discussions to which this interest has given rise, and in the arrangements by which they may terminate, the occasion has been judged proper for asserting as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by European powers. So he's not saying anything about the current governments, but there should be no future colonization at all by any country from Europe. But this is very packed. And then he says, in the wars of European powers, in matters relating to themselves, we never take any part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. The political system of the Allied powers is essentially different in this respect from that of America. And of course, I should have highlighted that, but these are my emphasis. But that's, of course, the issue. The difference proceeds from that which exists in the respective governments and the defense of our own, which has been achieved by the loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity. In this whole nation, felicity, this whole nation is devoted to that. We are devoted. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers. You can hear the resonance of the Declaration of Independence, why we declare independence, to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. And there's two other things. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. And I'll just jump forward in the middle of the paragraph. In the war between those new governments and Spain, remember, Spain still has control over certain countries, we declare our neutrality at the time of their recognition. And to this we have adhered and shall continue to adhere, provided no change shall occur, which, in the judgment of the competent authorities of this government, shall make a corresponding change on the part of the United States indispensable to their security. But in regard to those continents, circumstances are eminently and conspicuously different. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent, North and South America, without endangering our peace and happiness. Nor can anyone believe that our Southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition in any form with indifference. Now, this is remarkable because he's stating that people say the Monroe Doctrine is a sphere of influence, and even the Russian Foreign Ministry makes this mistake in their statements. It is not a sphere of influence. It is a sphere of principle that we respect every country to become a republic, that we respect their ability to develop, that we respect their develop, to have industry, to have agriculture, to have their children grow, and to not be under imperial rule. It's a sphere of principle. And we're saying this with very little power. We could not have backed this up if South America were attacked by Russia and Prussia and Great Britain, and it would not have been possible. But it's something that we said we were going to adhere to until we had the strength to be able to back this principle off. And secondly, this was a statement for this hemisphere, which was intended for Europe. And Europe knew it. And that's why they sent George Canning over to put this completely fake thing. Last point. What Canning was doing is that the British were going to take over, and did take over, many countries in Iberoamerica. For example, they never formally took over Argentina, but they controlled huge portions of Argentina. And in fact, as late as 1893, there was a world collapse. Why? Because a bank in Argentina collapsed. What bank was it? Barings Bank of Britain. They controlled this area. And all the trade America had was in pounds sterling, not in dollars. So, Chris, you may have ideas.
Yeah, well, I think, well, Richie's going to get more at this. I think he's got a better sense of the whole scope of the thing. But I was reading, there's a paper that he's written, which hopefully will be published soon, on this question of the development of Latin America. And there's a whole section, which I think you'll get into, on the question of Blaine, which is really important because, and I can just make some comments on it once you get to that point. We're going to talk about some Americans who were involved in the development of railroads in Latin America. So why don't you just continue?
Okay. The point is, I would just say, and we're going to see this, and we are going to look at this thing. And by the way, also a person who's very important in this is Henry Clay, who becomes the Secretary of State for John Quincy Adams when Quincy Adams becomes president, who already in the 1815s was calling for the recognition of America's and the independence. And this is what he had to say about the level of intelligence of Ibero-America. This is something that it wrote in March 24th, 1818. And he made this beautiful and historic speech in the House of Representatives. And I just want you to keep in mind what a certain American president, who will go unnamed at the particular moment, is saying about Ibero-Americans at this very second. He says, De Pons, Humboldt, and others concur in assigning to the people of South America great quickness, genius, and particular aptitude. And this is Alexander Humboldt, who toured Ibero-America. Aptitude for the acquisition of the exact sciences and others, which they have been allowed to cultivate in astronomy, geology, mineralogy, chemistry, botany, and so forth. They are allowed to make distinguished proficiency. They justly boast of their Abazate, Velasquez, Gama, and other illustrious contributors to science. They have 9 universities, and in the city of Mexico, it is affirmed by Humboldt, there are more solid scientific establishments than in any city, even in North America. So this was the view at that time. We just take yourself out of your current history and try and transport yourself back to what this fight was all about and what Americans thought of South America. So
at least Republican Americans with a small r.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's not what all Americans thought, obviously. Unfortunately, it's not what Andrew Jackson thought.
Right. No, exactly. Nor the slaveholders.
Right.
Absolutely.
Although Clay was there. There's ironies there, right? I mean, Clay was a slaveholder there, but he had a sense. You can tell that he still had a sense of the humanity and the potential genius of everybody. It's a very complicated situation, and there was a comment earlier that showed up also that said, I knew that this was global, and I think that Richie, we were talking about this earlier, that this question of John Quincy Adams and the idea of the community of principle among sovereign nation states, that one of the misinterpretations, and you can see because Monroe talks about our continent, right? This kind, or our part of the world, I guess you could interpret it as that. But it's not really about that. It's about a principle of against the empire system globally. They're certainly not going to let it, they're not going to let it happen in South America, but it's not that they weren't interested in defeating colonialism everywhere, in Africa, in Asia, everywhere else. These were philosophical minds. So, anyway.
Exactly. No, exactly. And when you read Quincy Adams, we won't have time for it here, but he gives this, one of his last speeches is the 1843 speech he gives to the Cincinnati Observatory, where they're opening this astronomical observatory, and his view of man's science and the role of mankind universally. This is what you're talking about. This is what the thinkers of the United States were thinking about. And I would just remind people, if you've never been to Mount Vernon, I would really suggest you go. But they used to have a better arrangement of the books of the library of George Washington. That's the home of George Washington. And you used to be able to see some of them. And one of the books that George Washington had is he had a Don Quixote in Spanish, and he had Don Quixote in English. And if you're thinking of how you have to deal with the Sancho Panzas and the Quixotes, who are disoriented oligarchs in founding a country, this is the richness that was represented by our founders in many, many ways. And as Chris and I were talking about, this is a continuation of Washington's farewell address, which largely was written by Alexander Hamilton. But I think it goes to the whole level of principle. Not that doesn't, the earlier one doesn't, but it's almost at like not a higher level, but it's more universal in the way it's posed. I just want to pose one thing, which is a conference that was being held, and I'll say this very briefly, and then what Chris talked about, and it was called the Infictionic Conference, and it was called by Simón Bolívar, but he didn't exactly want the United States there. However, the leaders of Mexico and leaders of Colombia did. So we were invited to attend, and it had Gran Colombia, many countries. And the interesting thing is we sent 2 ministers, but before they went, there was a debate in the House, which I won't go through all the, whether they should go. And so they got there. One of the ministers, Richard Anderson, died on the way, and another, John Sargent, who Chris knows quite a bit about, got there just too late. But this was a part of what we were 1826, just 3 years after the Monroe Doctrine. What I'd like to point to is something that,
hey, Richie, what was the argument for why they shouldn't go?
Oh, it was a slavery question.
Yeah,
because they had abolished. Oh no, I'll go into. I didn't.
Oh, good. Okay.
No, what happened is
it's outrageous.
abolished slavery, and the Southern Confederacy, which was not called that at that time, but there were enough people who were part of that, and within 20 years they would be running their Knights of the Golden Circle and trying to do raids into Ibero-America, South America. Many of those countries had abolished slavery. Not all of them. Brazil had not, and the United States had slavery, and so there was the debate was it was on that question. Is that what
Haiti was going to be represented there, right?
Absolutely. Haiti was going to be represented there, which very unfortunately our president's called a shithole. But the interesting thing is Toussaint Louverture had a collaborator in founding the Constitution of Haiti, and his name was Alexander Hamilton, who helped write it. So this is again this whole fight that Chris was mentioning. It goes on entirely, but the point was that the United States decided to begin developing other parts of the world, and I just want to mention Henry Meigs, who was a rail builder, and Anton Chaikin, a historian, has written about this very well. But the point was that he had gone to Peru, and he had developed in Peru 700 miles of rails going through the Andes. Consider how remarkable that is, and that's going to have direct bearing on what the 1889-1890 conference that was convened by Blaine actually put forward. And as you mentioned, it has relevance to the Chancay port today. I mean,
so the United States, Americans, were building. You also had who's it, Palmer, who's
yes,
right in his
William
Palmer, yeah, who's I don't know, maybe he's Army Corps of Engineer. I'm not sure, but he's in the U.S. military. He's a Union general, and his focus is on building railroads across to the west in the United States, but also south into Mexico to collaborate with Juarez in Mexico. And Meigs builds railroads in Chile, from Santiago to Valparaiso. So from the capital to the port, and then later he goes to Peru and builds railroads in Peru. As Rich said, 700 out of their 1,200 miles of railroads are built by an American, and so the Chinese just built the Chancay port and there's a discussion going on, and the idea was that they were planning to see, could they build a railroad across the Andes, all the way across the Andes, and then and all the way to the other side of the continent into Brazil or into Argentina. And so this was the discussion that was going on. But this is what Meigs did, and so just that's what the United States was doing 150 years ago, 160 years ago. Is that right?
1868 through 1877. This is Meigs' work in it's towns of Puna and Lake Titicaca and so forth. Yes, absolutely.
Right. What are we doing now? We're trying to stop China from building railroads in Peru. But are we proposing that we build railroads in Peru? Absolutely not. So it's, if you want to think about how far we have fallen away from our mission, who we are as Americans, how far we've fallen away from the actual concept of the Monroe Doctrine, well, there's a perfect and sad example.
Yep, exactly. And, this gets at, I think, Chris, this gets at this question of that the Monroe Doctrine is a sphere of principle, actually, for the whole world, because you will find the Monroe Doctrine in this Amphictyonic conference. And I gave it really short shrift. It's a very, very fascinating thing, but you can see what America was thinking. You see it in, of course, the collaboration between Benito Juarez and Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War against Maximilian, the French being put on the throne of Mexico. You see it in this conference, which I'm going to mention, in 1889, 1890, to set up a customs union for all of the Americas, with the exclusion of Canada. You see this in President Roosevelt's development of the good neighbor policy. You see that with Roosevelt working with Vargas and others in Brazil in creating the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund on the basis of developing anti-entropic growth in the world, not just, what we now associate with those two institutions, which have veered very far from their path and are rather destructive. So this is a thread that has gone through the entire American history, and really it is the best way to conceive of, I think, of one of the ways to conceive of the policy of Quincy Adams. It is the Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, and the American system stated internationally. And in fact, when Quincy Adams, I think he was in Moscow or one of the places, I forget, St. Petersburg. Well, when he was in one of the countries, he writes back and he says that one of the things he's thinking of is the American system of foreign policy. So this really is one indivisible conception in the minds of every great Republican, as Chris said, since the country was conceived, and for those purposes that we have said, to do good in the world, as Cotton Mather says. So I'll just mention this other thing, and Chris should just jump in. This is a very fascinating thing, which is it's completely blacked out from America. What you have, if I could just show one more picture, Diane, yeah, let me just show one more. This is James Blaine. Now, Blaine was Secretary of State twice. The most important period is the first one, March 9th, 1889 through June 4th, 1892. But he was also Secretary of State March 8th, 1880, through 3 months of 1889. I'll tell you why that was cut very short. Blaine, if you read my 20 years of life in the Congress, or my 20 years in the Congress, which I absolutely recommend everybody read, or get it out of the library and just read some of the chapters. He has running commentaries on the American Civil War. He goes through, for example, Cecil, Lord Salisbury, how he was part of the independent states independent support of the Southern Confederacy. He documents Liverpool and London as financing the ships that attacked America during the Civil War. This was something he knew. He was president, not president. He was in the Congress, and then of course Secretary of State. He was one House of the head of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. But this is what Americans knew at that time, which is different than what Americans know. And he speaks very, very strongly. If we can publish this thing, you'll read some of his quotes about the British. This is someone whose eyes are wide, wide open on this question. And I would say that, Henry C. Carey dies in late 1879. And with the death of Carey, the continuator of that tradition of spokesman for the American system is really James Blaine. And he takes that mantle upon himself. Now, I just want to, he organizes a conference in 1889, beginning in September and ending in March. It's a 6-month conference in which every major country in South America is invited to create a customs union. An international railway, a bank for South America, and so forth. It's one of the boldest things possible. I just want to mention why he was only Secretary of State for 3 months earlier. I hope I have those dates correct. No, I don't. They should be 1881, March 8th, 1881 through June 4th, 1881. He was the Secretary of State for James Garfield. And James Garfield was going to have this conference in 1881. So change it from March 8th, 1880 in your mind, 1889 to 1881, and June 4th to 1881. And Garfield was going to have the conference that Blaine wanted to have. But he and Garfield were standing on the station in Washington, D.C., and a British deployed person who was highly unstable steps up behind Garfield and shoots him in the head. And he dies. In fact, he died in Blaine's arms, which made this very, very strong impression on Blaine, of course. But that's what happens to American presidents, Lincoln and others before and after. So then when there's another election, and I will also say Blaine was very close to being president of the United States. He had won the Republican nominations. The Republicans had won all the presidencies since the Civil War. And he would have won, except the group around the Morgans, called the Mugwumps, allied with the Democrats to deny him the presidency. And there was, it's an incredible story unto itself. So he makes a decision that he's going to hold this conference. And I only want to highlight a couple of things about this conference, though it's remarkable in 3 phases. And let me just pick up my notes, which fell on the floor. I'm sorry. What they did is we invited 7 countries from Ibero-America or from South America, every existing country, and the Philippines, to this conference. And in opening the conference in Washington, D.C., and his presentation is, it's in March, it's in October of 1889. It's October 3rd. And he says that this aggregate territorial extent of these nations represents little short of 12,000 square miles, which is 1/4 of the globe. And it represents an aggregate population of 120 million. But if they were as densely populated as the average of Europe, it would represent 1 billion people. And this is even a larger percentage of the people in the globe. And he says, here's what I want to do. I want to say that a conference which will tolerate no spirit of conquest, these are his opening remarks, but will aim to cultivate an American sympathy as broad as both continents, that at no distant day, the railway systems of the North and South will meet upon the Isthmus of Panama, and evils which have long and cruelly afflicted afflicted the older nations of the world will not afflict them. We believe that the spirit of justice, of common and equal interest between the American states will leave no room for an artificial balance of power like that unto which has led to wars abroad and drenched Europe in blood. And then the last thing he said is that this shall be so developed and so regulated that each country shall acquire the highest possible advantage from the enlightened and enlarged intercourse of all. So I'm just going to mention what they did. So they get there, and I'll try and keep this short. They get there, and what is done next? All these people are put on a train, a special train. It's assembled, and they are visit for weeks America's agricultural lands, its scientific factories, places, its factories, one city after another. I'm just going to read. These are from the notes. This is from the transcripts that you can get of this thing. So it says, October 3rd, leave Jersey City. Okay, and they have an unveiling of Generals Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan's portraits. Okay, so they get to Worcester, Massachusetts, visit Threadworks. Then they go to Willimantic, Connecticut. They visit the skill mills. Then they leave South Manchester, Connecticut. They arrive at Hartford, visit various manufactories. Next, they go to Ohio. They're being taken across the United States. This is it's a 6-month conference, but this is not a BS conference. We are serious about making a transformation. This is the Monroe Doctrine. So they then arrive. These are all notes from the conference. Arrive Newburgh, visit rolling mills and nail works, Bessemer Steel Work, and Northern Ohio, a hospital for the insane, because they wanted to show them the levels of work that was going on. Then they go to Omaha, then Sioux City, visit to South Omaha stockyards and packing houses. Then they go to St. Louis, this will be the last one. Visit St. Louis Stamping Works, Kingsland and Douglas Factory, Dozier Wild Cracker Factory, Hamilton Brown Shoe Factory, Anheuser-Busch Brewery. And the thing is filled with this. And then they have discussions. And then they take them to agricultural lands in Philadelphia. They visit the famous Baldwin Locomotives Works and things like that. And then they regather on November 13th, right after more than a month and 10 days of this, to now say, what do we want to make Ibero-America, South America look like? So I'm just going to take 3 things. I just want to show you this. They set up a committee for the development of the rail system. And this Blaine really works very hard on. So if I could have the next. Okay. This is the map. I know it's very hard to see, but this is the Intercontinental Railway map. And they set up a commission of 3 people on each one. And you can see the American rail system, but then going down the western spine, the Pacific spine of Ibero-America, you can see the rail lines. It crosses Panama, goes all the way down in the southern part below Brazil. You can see all the rail lines and so forth. This is what we're showing today in our World Land Bridge. And they were discussing this in 1889. I mean, this was released in 1904. And they have all the plans. And then when they talk about this and to build it, they say, okay, we will have we'll have certain people invest and so forth. But the governments will give subsidies and grants to make this happen. This is Hamiltonian economics. The other thing they discussed, 2 other things I'll mention. One was vessels. They're going to build vessels in shipyards in the United States and elsewhere. Almost the myths of what the Monroe Doctrine is are accompanied by the myths that America was just a horrible imperialist country, always raping Latin America, South America. It's nonsense. Were there nasty people? Of course. It was just the opposite. All the trade by 1889, all of it, 69% of it was in British bottom vessels. All of it was in pounds sterling, because America didn't have a currency after the shenanigans that went on, and we restored it with the greenback. But then, as you remember, specie resumption recalls the greenback, so there's no currency. So it's done in pound sterling. The British are raping Ibero-America. That's what's going on. And what this is saying, and he says it time and again, we have to take this back. We're shipping all these goods. They get our coins, and then they use it to buy British goods. The other two things I'll just say. So they wanted vessels to do. They wanted a telegraph. They broke up into commissions, an international telegraph system. Remember, there aren't telephones at that time, so that's a pretty advanced thing. But then they call for a Bank of South America. And it's to finance raw materials and so forth, but it's to finance development projects. This is a bank for the entire continent. And lastly, they set up a system, they proposed a system that would make the arbitration, which is what Roosevelt also wanted, so they would have no wars. Now, that doesn't end war. We know that. Economic development does. This is loaded with economic development. So they were working on a total picture. And then the customs union, where they were the right customs, like the Zollverein that List set up in Germany. It would be individual countries. They wouldn't be one country. But that's what they were doing. This is the Monroe Doctrine. This is the history of the United States and what the Monroe Doctrine did. And then there's later periods which we could talk about. So I'm sorry if it took a little while, but that gives you an overview.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, well, so somebody made a comment that they thank you for reasserting what the truth is about the Monroe Doctrine. I thought I knew, and it turns out I did know, but I'm being confused by the way it's being discussed now. And look, I mean, so it's really stark. I mean, this map that you showed is from 1904. Now, what's going on in 1904? I mean, it makes it all the more polemical because you had McKinley, who follows along not long after these conferences, right? And in 1901, he's in Buffalo at a American exhibition, talking about discussing the developments of industry and science in the United States, but also in the whole world, right? And he's essentially proposing. You have representatives from all over the world there, and he's proposing that we spread this science and technology and power to the whole world. And he's assassinated. And who becomes president as a result is Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt in 1904 with this Roosevelt Corollary, which Richie knows a lot more about than I do, but I just wanted to bring it up because this is where the confusion comes in. Right, Rich? Because because what Roosevelt does is he turns the whole thing upside down, because you have warships at the time show up in Venezuela, I believe it was Venezuela at the time, yes, who couldn't pay her debt at that moment. And in 1901, and there's an article in EIR, which from last week's, so everybody should be subscribing to EIR if you want to know the history on these things. We've done tremendous work on this. And there you go. There's a word from our sponsor. Right on time. So in 1901, what Drago says is he's the foreign minister, Luis Drago, I believe. He's the foreign minister from Argentina.
Right.
And he says, look, I'm not saying that nations shouldn't pay their debts. And sometimes nations can be afflicted by circumstances where they're not able to pay their debts on time, and therefore the debt has to be reorganized. But what can never happen is for the nations that they owe those debts to be allowed to come in and alter the government in some way, take away the sovereignty of that nation in order to collect the debt, destroy the economy of that nation in order to collect the debt. There's a principle of sovereignty of nation states. This is not to say they shouldn't pay their debts, but it may have to be reorganized. And of course, that's a whole topic in and of itself, going back to Alexander. I mean, Alexander Hamilton believed in us paying our debts from the American Revolution, but he said it's got to be reorganized because, and he was brilliant. He used our debt as credit to invest through the First National Bank, which he created, to develop the physical economy of the United States such that we were able to repay those debts without just squeezing the debt out of the population, right? So these countries show up and they demand the right to squeeze the debt out of the population of Venezuela. And Teddy Roosevelt says, absolutely. And we will help you do that because the Monroe Doctrine says these nations in Latin America, they're in our sphere of influence. And when those nations grow up and they become responsible enough to pay their debts, then they won't have to fear us from having to come down and impose, this sad but necessary military policy of getting the debt. But it completely turns the Monroe Doctrine upside down with this so-called Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And I know we're running up against time, but it's so fascinating what Rich develops in this paper, which has got to be published very soon. But how Franklin Roosevelt comes in right in his 1933 March 8th, right? It's the inaugural address, and the good neighbor policy is established by FDR in his inaugural address. But later on, he works with the presidents of Mexico, Cardenas. He works with the president of Brazil, Vargas, and these presidents are nationalists in the best sense, that the way that Franklin Roosevelt is. I mean, in the sense of the way FDR developed our nation with rural electrification, Tennessee Valley Authority, Hoover Dam, all these amazing infrastructure projects that completely transformed the physical economy of the United States. He had friends and allies in Brazil and Mexico and other parts of the world that modeled their economic policies exactly on that. And so, for example, in Brazil, they set up their first really modern steel production under Vargas that produced more, I don't know, 1 million tons of steel, I think you said in your paper.
Bigger than any other country in this hemisphere except for the United States. It was
right.
Gigantic for its time. And we financed it through the Export-Import Bank and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Absolutely. Just one thing, it was very interesting. In Mexico, when Lázaro Cárdenas nationalizes the oil, which he does at 38, the British, under Lazard and Shell, through Eagle Oil, which had been 60% of all the oil on Mexico, they shut down Mexico. They prevent them from exporting oil. Sound familiar at all? But the thing about it is that Roosevelt knew what he wanted to do. So he gets his old friend, who was his boss at the Navy. Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of Navy during World War I. And the Secretary of Navy, I'm just struggling for his name at the second, he makes him the ambassador. And then he goes past the State Department. And the United States says, we're not going to complain about the nationalization. And there'll be compensation. Oh, but you know what? You've been running down your oil reserve. And Standard Oil had the other 30%, and there was other smaller ones. So it was Standard and Shell. He said, but you guys have not been repairing your equipment for about a long time. So we will we'll compensate you for what it's really worth. But the thing was, he averted something that was very dangerous, because what the British wanted, and they were financing this group called Cristo Rey, which became the PON afterwards. They wanted to they were providing rifles. They were going to create a war on the border of the United States. 38, 39, we're preparing for World War II. I mean, this was extremely dangerous stuff that the British will always do. The last thing I will just say is in Brazil, these were people who were thinkers. They were nationalists. They had plans. When our team went down there for the mission to Brazil, the Brazilians, there was an equal team of Americans under Morris Llewellyn Cook, who set up the REA, the strong electrical wires across the country and so forth. He was very close with Roosevelt. He was an assistant. He was the advisor to Roosevelt when Roosevelt was governor of New York in the early 30s. But the point was, they just collaborated and drew up a plan to totally redesign Brazil. It's the same Monroe Doctrine. Because if you believe a country has the right to sovereignty, sovereignty will only mean something if you believe that every child has a divine mind and a creative mind to develop, and that they have full rights to develop as nations. And that's why what Helga Zepp-LaRouche is saying today in her 10 principles is of this spirit. It was established under very hard conditions, where we became the first real republic, any nation of large size, that wasn't a city-state, to ever take an experiment and create a republic. And then we developed, as Quincy Adams himself said, we developed the American system in foreign policy.
Thank you.
Can I show one slide, Diane?
Of course you may. And then
it will be of relevance to your appearance here, your reappearance. There we are. we were just up in Quincy visiting some dear friends, and we went down, and it's the 400th anniversary of the city of Quincy, 1625. So they put up a beautiful statue of John Quincy Adams downtown. As far as I know, it's the first statue that they put up. And you can see on there, he has books on his table. He's obviously a very, very learned person. That's what they wished to bring out in this. And then they have 4 different things, but this is John Quincy Adams and Monroe, and underneath it says 1823, the Monroe Doctrine. So I just wanted to show these because hopefully we can inspire a renaissance of people thinking about who John Quincy Adams is, and because he's a great thinker and a great president, a great Secretary of State, and a great congressman. After becoming, he went back into the Congress with not the sole purpose, but a main purpose of smashing the slaveocracy and crushing the slave system that was infecting our country, this evil. So he was really a great president, and hopefully this will inspire people who see his statue there to find out who this great man was and what the Monroe Doctrine really was. And I hope that tonight we were able to give people a sense of what the real Monroe Doctrine is and why we need to bring it back immediately, because there's some similarly ugly things happening right now in Venezuela, similar to 1904, which are not becoming of us as Americans.
No, I just want to really thank you both, and we don't have to stop quite yet. We have 10 more minutes or so, but our nation was founded to be good, and Americans want to be good. Americans want to do good in the world, but people are very confused. So they hear these things like peace through strength. Well, what does that mean but peace through force? It doesn't mean peace through reason or peace through a common interest or a shared exactly. And I was looking at the Kennedy quote, which everyone loves to cite, except they leave off the second half, which is the first half is ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That's the first half. The second half is fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America can do for you, but ask what together we can do for the freedom of man. And then he talks about the shared enemies of mankind: poverty, war, disease, I forget. But he understood deep in his bones, as Lynn used to say, there's something about people who were born and raised in the United States. It's in your bones. It's in your bones that our purpose was to do good. The city upon a hill, the beacon of hope and temple of liberty. What does that mean? It is not force. In a sense, it's a spiritual identity, if you will. And through the science of the American system of physical political economy, which Lyndon LaRouche developed further, you have the empirical physical basis to concretize a spiritual commitment. I'll put it that way, right? So it's not airy-fairy, but the way that it comes to exist is through the immortality of mankind as a species. And we increase our power over nature in an intelligible fashion, which allows the development and improvement of nature and the improvement of the human condition. And it's very ironic that the Chinese, these things are, they describe it differently, but they talk about a harmony with nature. And it's not at all the same thing as the fake environmentalist movement who want to get rid of the human race and only have mosquitoes or cockroaches or something. But the idea that man improves nature. But you have to cultivate this quality of reason, and reason is fed by doing good. I'll put it that way. And I just think it's so important for people to understand this and to have access to reading. Let us make these people intelligible. Okay.
Are there any questions in the chats or?
There's, Meg Galucci, I posted, said, thank you so much. Great program. And we appreciate that. Meg, presuming that that's your name. And then John O'Malley and Steve Kaler have been posting in the YouTube channel various comments. And our friend Michelle says there is apparently a virtual tour of Mount Vernon. It's good to go there in person, but you can apparently do it online. And then John O'Malley has also posted under the in the YouTube comments, he corrected all your dates, Rich. So what you had for Blaine, they're all there in the chat.
Great.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, and I will just once again, everybody, and I'm sorry that blocks Chris's face, but you must subscribe.
I will not be silenced.
That's right. Christopher Sayre is watching you. Get the daily alert.
Do it.
Do the $10 a month recurring donation. You need to be reading this. I just had an exchange with Ray McGovern on this via email, and he said he would like to do a public service announcement to tell people how invaluable the daily alert is. So everybody, thelarouche.org, thelarouche.org, you can find the donate button there, and you can pick a monthly donation and be getting this every day. So with that, this is our last symposium before 2026, the 250th year of our republic, which is going to become greater. We are going to perfect our union in the coming
years. And I hear
years.
There's a spear carrier of John Quincy Adams who's going to announce for president.
There are rumors to that effect. Rumors. Yes. So very good. We will see everybody next week.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.